He looks at your shoes when he talks to you. Not because he doesn't respect you, not because he's hiding something. He just does it, every time, without noticing. You've probably met someone like him. Maybe you've caught yourself doing it too, in the middle of a conversation that suddenly felt too close. There's a moment right before it happens. A question gets asked, or a silence stretches a second too long, and something in the chest tightens first. The eyes move before the mind decides anything. Down, or sideways, or toward a spot on the wall that suddenly seems very interesting. It looks small from the outside, almost nothing, but something about it always lingers longer than it should. I remember watching a man at a dinner table once, answering every question perfectly, saying all the right things. His words were warm. His eyes were somewhere else entirely. And I kept wondering why two things that are supposed to move together, kindness and presence, had quietly split apart in him. He wasn't lying. He wasn't rude. So what exactly was he avoiding? The strange part is that he probably couldn't have told you either. If you'd asked him directly, he might have laughed it off. "I've just always been like this," he might say, as if it were a fixed trait, like height or handedness, something built into him from birth. But the more you watch someone who does this, the less it looks like a trait. It starts to look like a pattern with a very specific shape. It shows up more in certain rooms than others, more with certain people than others, more in certain kinds of moments, especially the ones that ask for something real. A trait wouldn't behave that way. A trait doesn't disappear when he's alone with his dog, laughing at nothing, looking straight at the mirror while he talks to himself. So if it isn't simply who he is, then what is actually happening in that half second when his gaze drops? Here's the part that catches most people off guard. The eyes are one of the most direct lines to another person's inner state that a human body has. When two people look at each other, something is being exchanged that neither of them fully controls. Interest, threat, warmth, judgment, hunger, boredom. All of it leaks through, whether either person wants it to or not. Most of the time, this exchange feels effortless. You look, you're looked at, nothing happens, life goes on. But for some people, that exchange feels like standing in the open with no wall in front of them. Not always.
Not with everyone. Just in certain moments, with certain kinds of attention pointed at them. And once you notice that pattern, a much bigger question opens up. What is it about being truly seen that some people experience as danger? Watch him a little longer, and something else appears, something almost contradictory. He isn't a weak man. He argues his opinions clearly. He takes up space in a room. He can be funny, sharp, even commanding. And yet the very same man will look away the second a conversation turns personal. The stronger he sounds, the more his eyes seem to search for an exit. It's as if confidence and eye contact were supposed to travel together, and in him, they had come apart. You'd expect the loudest people in a room to be the most comfortable being looked at. Often, it's the opposite. Some of the most talkative, most socially skilled people carry the tightest resistance to direct eye contact, especially in quiet one-on-one moments. Loud can be armor. Eye contact removes armor. And once his voice goes quiet, and it's just two people looking at each other, something in him has to work very hard to stay still. That effort has a cost, even if nobody in the room can see it. You can hear it, sometimes, in a slight shift of subject, a joke dropped in a moment that didn't need one. If this isn't fear in any obvious sense, then it has to be coming from somewhere older than the conversation itself. Where does a body learn that being seen is something to manage rather than something to enjoy? Nobody is born flinching from a gaze. Watch any infant and you'll see the opposite, an almost hungry pull toward the human face, especially the eyes. Babies stare. They study faces the way scientists study data, searching for safety, searching for love, searching for permission to exist exactly as they are. So somewhere between that hungry infant stare and the grown man studying his shoes, something got rewritten. Not necessarily by cruelty, sometimes just by 1,000 small moments that told a nervous system the truth wasn't entirely welcome here. A parent whose eyes went cold at the wrong times. A house where being noticed too much meant being criticized, or where being invisible was the safest way to survive an unpredictable adult. None of this has to be dramatic to leave a mark. A child doesn't need abuse to learn caution. Sometimes all it takes is a home where love came with conditions that were never spoken out loud, only felt again and again until the body understood the rule before the mind ever did. Eyes are where those conditions get tested first. If someone's face has ever hardened the moment yours opened up, some part of you remembers that, long after the memory itself has faded. The brain doesn't file this away as a story, it files it away as an instruction. Direct eye contact equals exposure. Exposure equals risk, so look away before the risk becomes real. This isn't a decision anyone makes on purpose. It happens faster than thought, in the same reflex system that pulls a hand back from something hot.
And once that reflex is built, it doesn't need the original danger to keep firing. It just needs anything that resembles it. A stranger's stare, a parent's sudden question, a partner saying, "Look at me when I'm talking to you," which should feel like intimacy and instead can feel like a spotlight aimed at something unfinished. So the pattern was never really about the eyes at all. It was about what the eyes have always threatened to reveal. Now, picture him in a meeting, 3 years into his career, finally being asked a direct question by someone senior. He knows the answer, he's known it the whole time, but the moment 15 faces turn toward him, his gaze drops to the table, his voice thins out, and the good answer comes out sounding uncertain, apologetic, smaller than it should. Nobody in that room can see what's actually happening inside him, they just see someone who seems unsure. I've watched this exact scene play out more times than I can count. Talented people shrinking the instant they're looked at directly, as if visibility itself were the obstacle, not the content of what they know. It isn't about competence, it's about what happens to competence the second it becomes visible. Now, picture a different moment, a first date, the kind where two people are trying to figure out if there's something real between them. She keeps circling back to lighter topics, keeps her eyes moving toward the menu, the window, anything but his face, right when he says something that actually mattered to him. He notices. He starts to wonder if she's simply not interested, if there's no chemistry here, if he's misread everything. But that's not what's happening at all. She's interested, more than she's let herself admit, and that's exactly the problem. Interest raises the stakes. Raised stakes make the eyes feel unbearably loud. So she does the only thing that feels manageable. She turns the volume down by looking away. And now, picture one more moment. A phone call this time. Not even a face, just a voice. But somehow, this feels worse. A friend calls to check in after a hard week, and the second the questions get too kind, too specific, the answers get vague, rushed, wrapped in a laugh that doesn't quite land. "I'm fine, really. It's not a big deal." Kindness, it turns out, can trigger the exact same retreat as suspicion once did, because being cared for closely still means being looked at closely, and closely has never felt entirely safe. A meeting, a date, a phone call, 3 completely different situations, 3 completely different kinds of people involved, and yet, underneath all of it, the same quiet motion keeps repeating itself. Something is noticed, the gaze retreats before the noticing goes any further. Once you start seeing that pattern, you start seeing it everywhere, in other people, sometimes in yourself. And once it's been seen a few times, it stops looking like separate incidents. It starts looking like a system. That system runs quietly, in the background, and it's very good at one thing above all else, keeping vulnerability from staying in the open for too long. Every time the gaze drops and nothing bad happens, the brain doesn't conclude that the danger was never real. It concludes that looking away is what kept the danger from happening. That's the trap hiding inside this whole pattern. The avoidance feels like proof of its necessity every single time, precisely because avoiding worked. Nothing bad happened, so the strategy gets stronger, not weaker, with every use. The world doesn't get to argue with that logic because the world never gets the chance to prove the danger wasn't there in the first place. Slowly, without any single dramatic moment, life starts rearranging itself around this one small motion. Certain conversations get avoided. Certain relationships stay shallower than they might have been. Certain rooms feel exhausting for reasons that are hard to explain to anyone who hasn't lived inside this particular body.
And here's the part that matters most. None of this makes someone broken. It makes someone protected by a system that once had very good reasons for existing. Maybe the problem was never who you are. Maybe it was simply how carefully your mind learned to guard the most exposed part of you. That reframing changes something, quietly, the moment it lands. It's not, "Why am I like this?" anymore. It's, "Of course I learned this. Look at what I was protecting myself from." Compassion enters exactly where shame used to sit, and that shift alone starts to loosen the grip the pattern has been holding. Because here's a strange truth about protection systems. They only stay this strong when they go unnoticed. The instant someone actually sees the pattern clearly, names it gently without judgment, something in its power starts to soften almost immediately. Not because the fear disappears, because the automatic nature of it does. A choice starts to exist where there used to be only reflex. And choice is a very different thing than fear. So the shift isn't about forcing eye contact, staring someone down until it stops feeling strange. That would just be one more form of pressure aimed at an already overwhelmed nervous system. The real shift is smaller than that, and much quieter. It starts with noticing the exact moment the eyes want to drop, and instead of following that pull automatically, just staying present for 1 extra second, 1 second longer than usual. Not perfect eye contact, not forced intensity, just 1 more second of staying in the room with whatever feeling showed up right before the retreat. That single second is where everything changes, because in that second, the nervous system gets new information it has never had before. It gets to discover that being seen, just this once, just this little bit longer, didn't lead to the danger it always predicted. Repeat that enough times in small enough doses, and the old rule starts to lose its grip, not through force, but through evidence. The evidence says something different now. Being looked at didn't cost anything this time, or the next time, or the time after that. And once that evidence builds, something else becomes possible. Not perfect comfort, nobody promises that, but a little more room to breathe inside a gaze that used to feel like exposure. Go back to that man at the dinner table, the one with warm words and wandering eyes. Nothing about that dinner has to be relived exactly. None of it needs undoing. But imagine him now, mid-sentence, catching the pull toward the wall, and instead choosing to stay just slightly longer with the person actually in front of him. It isn't dramatic. Nobody at that table would even notice the difference. But he would. Because for the first time in a long time, something in him stayed present for a feeling instead of escaping from it. And that single second belongs entirely to him. The eyes that once dropped from every meaningful moment are the same eyes that can slowly learn something new, 1 second at a time, 1 room at a time, 1 honest conversation at a time. Nothing about the past needs to be erased for that to be true. The pattern was never a flaw in who he was. It was evidence of how hard some part of him worked to keep him safe, long after the actual danger had already passed. And maybe that's the real ending here. Not a moment where the fear disappears completely, but a moment where it finally gets to be understood instead of just obeyed. If any part of this felt familiar while you were reading it, sit with that for a second before moving on. Maybe it was the shoes, or the menu, or the phone call that got cut short on purpose. Whatever it was, you're welcome to share it, because somewhere, someone else reading this is probably nodding along in exactly the same way. And if this is the kind of thing that keeps catching your attention, the next story picks up right where this one leaves off.